Okay, cottage finances. How do we, once mom and dad again are no longer here to write the checks, how do we divide up the expenses of operating the place? Well, the most common way is to allocate them according to the member's sharing ratio. Your sharing ratio is just simply your percentage ownership. So in my wife's case, she's a 25% owner. She has a 25% sharing ratio in the LLC. And the way that most families go at it is to add up all of the expenses at the end of the year, and then they will allocate those expenses according to percentage ownership, and everybody that has an ownership is then obligated to pay their proportionate share of the expenses. I've had some families, including again my wife's own family, that initially started out trying to divide expenses into two buckets. One bucket is what I call the ownership expenses, and those are expenses that are incurred regardless of occupancy. They're things like taxes and insurance and routine maintenance. The other bucket of expenses are what accountants or economists would call variable expenses as opposed to fixed. Those expenses are incurred because somebody is occupying the place. Expenses such as utilities and garbage and internet and those expenses that you wouldn't incur if no one were occupying the place. But because somebody is occupying it, you've got to pay these things. Well, what many families find is that the amount of ownership expenses or the fixed expenses tend to be 85 to 95% of the total cost of operating a place over the course of the year. And so many families just simply say the cost of changing or reallocating the two kinds of expenses is not worth the effort. Other families are perfectly content to go through the effort that is required to count noses and see who was in the place, how many nights, and how much utility expense and other variable expenses were incurred during the year, and go ahead and do two allocations, one of the ownership expenses and one of the variable expenses. My own recommendation would be don't worry about that kind of reallocation. Look at what it costs to operate the place for an entire year and allocate that according to percentage ownership. Now, if somebody isn't in the place and doesn't use the property for 2, 3, or 4 years, you might ask the question then, is it fair to continue to ask them to pay a proportionate share of expenses? My answer is yes, it absolutely is fair because they have an ownership. They have a choice. If we have the put provision in there that allows people to sell their interest back to the company, they can choose at any time to exit the company and eliminate the need for annual contributions. Where things get a little more difficult to sort out is where somebody wants to maintain ownership but not pay any expenses. Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there's only a limited number of other places you can go to get those expenses covered. They're the other siblings. And if somebody has an ownership interest but doesn't come, that's their choice. And they need to either pay their share of the ownership expenses or they need to talk about exiting the ownership one way or the other. But it really is, at least in the view of most families, including me, a situation where everybody that has an ownership ought to be paying their share of the expenses. Many families find it's helpful to prepare an annual budget and what I call an annual report. The annual budget is just looking forward. It's typically based on what did we spend last year, here's what we expect to spend next year. And by giving that at the beginning of the year, family members that have to make a financial contribution oftentimes feel that they have better control over their finances by knowing what their commitment for the coming year is going to be. And that's the annual budget. And it isn't always just what we did last year because you can only put off replacing the roof for so long. You can only put off drilling a new well or replacing a septic field for so long. And at some point, those expenses are going to have to be incurred. And so doing the annual budget is a good way of letting people know what their commitment is going to be for the coming year. That annual budget is typically based or started on what did it cost to operate it last year, and that's the annual report. And so those two documents or reports are very oftentimes specified in the operating agreement. All right, the last way of dealing with cottage finances is to create what we call an endowment. And this is not a tax-sheltered arrangement. It is not a device that will protect the inherent value of anything, as many endowments are designed to do. It is simply a pot of money that is created within the LLC typically, but not required to be there. It could be operated by a trust, it could be operated by a bank or another entity outside the LLC, but it's simply a pot of money that is used in one of two ways to defray expenses. If the pot is large enough, and if you're getting better rates of return than the 0.2% that CDs are offering today, then you can use the income from the endowment to pay the expenses. And if you're fortunate enough to have a large enough pot, that is, I should say, if your children are fortunate enough that you left a large enough pot, you can eliminate most of the cottage expenses, and therefore you pay for them out of that income, and therefore the owners, the kids, don't have to come up with money out of their own pocket. The other way that you can do it is to allow part of the endowment itself to be used to pay expenses. And I do that at the request of families who know that the endowment is going to be consumed in a relatively short period of time, but it will give the family 5 years or 10 years or whatever the number turns out to be, a period of time to become acclimated to paying out of their own pocket the expenses once the endowment is totally used. It is a very good way of equalizing the enjoyment of children at the next generation who have unequal amounts of financial resources. Okay, what if somebody doesn't pay? We talked about that before, the allocations and so forth. Many families say, you know, we really, and I get this from the heirs more than I do the founders, many of the families say, I want to have some mechanism for how do we deal with a question if somebody doesn't pay when they're supposed to. So one thing we can do is, I have a menu, a list of options that the family can choose from. And one of the things we can do is impose a late payment fee. That is, if you don't pay on time, we add 10% or we add $500 or whatever to your assessment for the year. I'm not a big fan of that because in most cases when people don't pay, it's because they don't have the dollars to do it. And adding to the bill just makes the hole that much deeper they have to dig out of in order to get back in good standing. About the only time that that late payment fee makes a lot of sense is if you have members of the family that are just simply absent-minded or don't, for whatever reason, pay much attention to calendars and schedules. And I use the example of my brother-in-law, who is a university professor and is a brilliant academic mind, but the calendar means absolutely nothing to him. So even though everybody else pays on time, he may send his contribution in 6 months late and say, oh, forgot it, here it is, go on in good faith. And the problem is the taxes still have to be paid, the insurance premium still has to be paid, all these costs are still incurred. And if the brother-in-law doesn't pay when he is supposed to, it means the other owners have to come up with money out of their own pocket. So in some cases, imposing a late payment fee is effective. More commonly, the approach that families take is to immediately suspend the use rights of an individual who is delinquent. And that is not only a motivational tool, it is also a conflict avoidance tool. Because I can assure you, if somebody is delinquent and still uses the property, other family members have to pay not only their own share, but they have to make up for the delinquency. And my experience is the spouses of the lineal descendants will become incredibly irate over the prospect of their brother-in-law using the place when I'm the one paying his share. So immediate suspension of use by the delinquent individual is very, very common. We can go on and extend that to suspending the use of the individual's entire branch. And if we looked at Andy's branch, Andy had 3 kids at the next generation, and at the point in time when they become owners, if one of those 3 children doesn't pay, the other 2 of Andy's children can't use the place either. And the reason, or the appeal that that has for many families, is that it gets the rest of the group out of the enforcement business. And it puts the pressure on the immediate siblings to either get the delinquent person to pay or to cover that by themselves so that the other members of the family, the other owners of the LLC, don't have to make up the shortfall. So we can extend that to the branch. We can also go on to suspend their voting rights or management participation. Those are not commonly done, but they are an option. But by far the most common is to trigger the call option, and that's what we talked about before, the ability to require somebody who is delinquent to sell their interest back to the company. The most common range of delinquencies of families that I work with is anywhere from 2 to 4 years. I've done it in as short as 12 months, and I've done it in as long as 10 years. I tend to favor the 2 to 4 year range, and I think many people would accept the fact that if somebody is delinquent for that period of time without a legitimate reason for being delinquent, then they really should give some serious thought to selling out and letting the rest of the family move on without having to deal with a delinquency.